I really am very honored to be joining the stage with such great individuals. So our topic for today is deep diving into outsourcing in 2020, how COVID-19 has forever changed the clinical trials landscape. And it is 4 o'clock on the East Coast, but hope everybody is ready for some action and wake yourselves up because it's going to be a great panel. Okay, let's get started. So a lot has happened this year. It's been really shocking if you actually sit back and think about all the change that has been going on in such a short time frame. So definitely in the face of adversity, we've seen all kinds of different businesses take swift action to both innovate and partner, not only for their success, but also for survival. So that has been very important. I think the word has been pivot. So that being said, when we talk about COVID-19, it definitely requires rapid action and innovation in any industry. In our industry in particular, we really need to partner. The challenge requires us to join forces. It's simply impossible to be an expert in all of these fast-paced developments that are being thrown our way. Usually, such partnerships take a long time to develop, easily months and years. Yet, we have seen some very fast-moving companies able to develop these very meaningful partnerships and achieve success in days and weeks. So we have seen that companies have been pivoting and partnering their way through COVID-19. So we have assembled an esteemed panel here to help you understand how you can evolve and modernize your company's outsourcing strategy to adapt and thrive in the new clinical trial landscape. So I'd love to introduce our panel. We will start with Katherine Arbour, who is joining us from Alexion as the Executive Director of Global Clinical Data Management. Go ahead, Katherine. Love to hear your introduction.
Thank you, Farah. Very nice to be with you all this afternoon, morning, evening. So at Alexion, I'm lucky to lead the traditional data management, but also our very forward-thinking, technology-driven data management, where we're using a lot of analytics and different ways of thinking, and that really played positively for when COVID came to us. So I'm here to share that information, and I look forward to talking with you.
Great, thank you. And we also have Beverly Paperiello, who's the SVP and Clinical Operations Consultant at Intellia. Beverly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for having me. I will give you a perspective of transitioning into a biotech position and understanding how to be efficient in utilizing kind of technology and also learnings from others that have been there in the COVID situation and how to piggyback on that and to be strategic about how you apply that within the construct of building out a new organization and taking your first drug to clinic.
Beautiful. And we have Mustafa Noor, who's the Interim Chief Medical Officer at AMAG Pharmaceuticals. Mustafa, would you like to say hello?
Yes, hello everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I will be able to give you a perspective from from a company that has a portfolio of mature products, commercially available products, as well as programs in late stage development. So this will be more of a more advanced pipeline than Beverly's biotech perspective. So I hope that'll complement her view as well.
Absolutely will. We also have Shannon Macquarie, who is the VP of Clinical Trial Operations at CATO SMS, to provide the CRO perspective.
Thank you, Farah. I'm looking forward to this discussion today, and the perspective that I'm hoping to bring is much more operational in nature, but certainly when all of this struck we had an entire portfolio of in-flight studies, but certainly other considerations that we've had to roll out with respect to how we're planning new study launches and keeping things on track with respect to timelines and milestones and the different kinds of providers that we're working with, and the type of evaluation that we have to go through when assessing how we'll put a strategy together, because it's not necessarily how it used to look. So looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. We're also joined by Shaheen Lakhan, who is the Executive Medical Director at Zogenix and has supported many companies in their development. Go ahead, Shaheen.
Great. Thank you, Farah, fellow panelists. It's great to see you as well, and the audience. Yes, I'm Boston-based, and I can provide quite a bit of perspectives from a number of companies that I've engaged with over this COVID-19. I've done biopharma, biotech, vendors, and technology solutions to support trial development. And interesting, I've been part of maybe 3 or 4 over the past several months during this pandemic, and I could share this experience with this audience. Thank you.
Excellent. And finally, we're also joined by Jay Russak, who is the Director of ClinOps at Dicerna Pharmaceuticals.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be returning after my discussion this morning. And building off of that, I have some direct relatable experiences as we have managed our way through continuing our rare disease program through COVID, and how we have managed to ensure to stay on track during these times.
Excellent. Okay, we are going to get started with a poll question just to make sure everyone is paying attention today. So we're going to start with a simple one. Question number 1, Sam, if you can bring them up. Has COVID-19 impacted your company's outsourcing strategy? Yes or no? We'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that. Sam, do we see the results right away?
In just 5 more seconds, I will close the poll.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. There you go.
Okay, pretty overwhelmingly yes at 83%. We'll go to the next question. Poll question 2. How has the pandemic affected your provider base and vetting due diligence process? So there's actually 3 choices here. Increased vetting, we need to ensure we select the right partners. Decreased vetting linked to volume, resource, or time constraints. Or the third is no change.
Another 5 or so seconds. 3, 2, 1.
Interesting. So we've seen that the 63% of respondents have indicated that they are looking for increased vetting to select the right partner. So I think that's a great segue into our conversation here, where we are talking about outsourcing as part of a strategy in clinical operations. So we're going to start with a general question to the panel. The pandemic has forced many companies to rethink their provider base as critical new services have emerged. We've seen that kind of echo through the discussions today. So just an open question, did your organizations launch a COVID-19 work stream related to partner relationships and provider selection? If you want to jump in, maybe raise your hand. I'm trying to see who can respond to that one.
I'll happy to start, and then maybe others can jump in. So,
Sure.
Certainly, I mean, I think that this is an unprecedented time. We're dealing with issues that I think a lot of us hadn't even thought of, and we're forced to revisit the way we conduct business. So certainly in the 20+ years that I've been in industry, this is the first time that I see it disrupted at a global stage and at the level that we're seeing, and I'm sure many of you are in the same boat. I think from clinical perspective, in clinical trial conduct, one of the ways that the pandemic has forced us to rethink our strategy is one that I think in some ways could be as difficult in the short term, but it could be actually beneficial in the long run. And that specifically is that rather than bringing patients to clinical trials, we're being forced to bring the clinical trial to the patients. And a lot of these parallels are, very much what we're observing in the clinical medical practice setting, where patients and providers are able to hold virtual meetings or virtual visits, and a lot of the care can be conducted virtually, and except for certain procedures, etc., day-to-day activities, follow-up of labs, discussion of test results, things like that, can be conducted virtually. And I think a lot of those things, learnings from that, and the change in the pattern of the ways that medicine is practiced these days, can be, replicated in the clinical trial setting. So I think that in that sense, I think what I don't want to do is, repeat what I was just beautifully, Sean, explained to us how it's being done, but in a way that we have to kind of think or, change our ways of thinking, how we approach clinical trial, and look at the clinical protocols from a perspective of what is really can be done virtually, what elements of this protocol can be brought to the patient, and what are our capabilities that we currently have, both internally and also with the vendors and the partners, that can pivot that way, can conduct the clinical trial in a way that we can bring the clinical trial to the patient. So I think that's the overarching theme that I feel is the change that was forced upon us, but I'm hoping that it'll be a change and a force for the better going forward.
Thank you. Bev, go ahead.
So giving, again, we play off of each other very nicely, Mustafa. So giving a little bit of a perspective from really kind of the early company at this moment in time, one of the things it also forces you to do is actually plan earlier, right? So we put a whole COVID plan together that talked about, as you come out of the first wave in the spring, how does that play with what you're doing in the fall and the trials and how you're bringing them up? And so we actually moved up the selection of several of our vendors so that the plan would be that, things like central lab, where the lead time is so much, and that's something that requires people to be in a space to do it. And so instead of getting kind of stuck with potentially the vendor we select not being able to go in and build the kits, we moved everything up in our timeline so that we wouldn't be at a place where we wouldn't have things like lab kits and those things that are material ready and available at that time. So that's their piece of the lens of how do you think about your providers, and maybe your typical timeline of 6 months or 4 months, give yourself a bit more time to allow for some of these, changing pieces, and also to work through what your strategy is around each of those vital pieces necessary to get your study up.
Absolutely. Great comments there. I'm going to move to the next question, unless somebody else wanted to jump in. Don't see any hands. Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Bev and Mustafa. Okay, next question. I think this segues really nicely onto Bev's comments. Expanding a provider base under the stresses of trial continuity, a landscape of uncertainty, and tight timelines presents some unique challenges. How can technology play a role in helping to better or faster identify, vet, compare, select, and manage providers for new services?
I can start. So again, I've been through big pharma down into the biotech. And so obviously I think everybody has different ways of approaching how they vet their various vendors and bring all that together. I will say that we had a very short timeline to pull some things together. And so I was fortunate enough to have an individual who's very seasoned in outsourcing direct me to what are some of the options around technologies when you don't have your own bid grid and you want to get through a lot of different vendors, not just the CRO, but some of the other ancillary vendors very quickly. So we actually through Farah's organization, we looked at a couple of different technologies in this space and actually spent a long time doing some of the vetting around just even the purchasing of the software. I will tell you that our experience was we were a little bit late to the game on getting our vendors into queue to select, and we made up about 4 to 5 weeks by having the use of that software, forcing it out to the various CROs, and having everybody's bids come in a consistent way, but the analytics around being able to look at all of that in a very quick manner was extremely useful. And we had our selection within 3 weeks of putting out our bid, and that included having all of the vendors in for the vendors we selected to go to part 2 to come in for bid defenses. And so using the technology available out there and not building it yourself or worrying that you've got to do something of that nature. There's several choices out there. We chose Clinical Maestro for multiple reasons. And I think multiple companies, if you take a look, you'll understand how we got there. But I will say that software was impressive and value added and was well worth the spend, and we'll continue to utilize.
Great. Thank you so much, Bev. Anyone else want to jump in on that? Katherine, I know you had quite a bit of change in this space and at Alexion around the reining them in. Would you like to share some of that?
Well, I was going to share for our phase 1s with healthy volunteers. We are a rare disease company and it's global. So we have a proprietary tool, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, where we were able to use forecasting to where COVID would go and kind of dodge where we were going to open these short-term healthy volunteer studies, because many of the locations had to close and they didn't close necessarily in the same time. So we were using technology in an AI analytic fashion to try to predict where COVID was going to flow, and then go to phase 1 units that were not in those locations and then oscillate them. So that was a huge advancement for our ability to continue to move on with our phase 1 research.
Very fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm just cognizant of the time here. Okay, this is a question for Shaheen, but definitely would love others to jump in. So Shaheen, you shared with me about your great experience assessing technology tools for various different companies to be applied in clinical trials. And you'd mentioned observing greater polarization in the resiliency of the provider landscape, certainly in the face of COVID-19. Can you share some of that experience with us and your insights?
Oh, sure. No, thank you, Farah, for the question and the premise too. First and foremost, I think I've divided a lot of the responses that I've seen and I actually took part of into reactive. That was in the midst of COVID-19. And if you had active trials or you had trials that were just about to recruit, you had to quickly pivot. And it was a test of your state of digital transformation, your resiliency on whatever domain you want to measure it on. And if you actually had good measures of communicating with your vendors and having a two-way type of communication, and then as we got data back, and actually we've used many of the same proprietary and external tools that have been mentioned thus far, and almost forecasting and predictions, and I'm going to say probably it was just as good as if I flipped a coin, because some states actually turned out to be great and others not, and reopened and closed in different phased approach. That's kind of my commentary on that. But it moved into a reactive into a proactive type of space. I would say it got comfortable 2 to 3 months into it, and now let's establish the checklist. Let's establish the vetting process. And of course, if you were disciplined before, you carried many of them over. If you were digitally transformed before, you carried those over. And then the special attention into even the specifics. I'm a neurologist. I still see, I have a small practice, and kind of looking into what your vendors are doing actually in their own response and own employer response to COVIDs and screenings of court sites and so on. Even the phase 1 studies, I think this was brought in, healthy volunteers. What do? We actually took approach of even having competitive types of enrollments, things that classically would be recruited in a matter of a month or two. We had to open up many sites and have these types of contingencies, especially when we saw holes in the processes that are going down. When I talk about this polarization and resiliency, I've been doing probably virtual trials for 4 or 5 years, and it's become a hot commodity in this type of environment. And the settings in which I was doing those, either hybrid or fully decentralized, those were much more advanced in their relations with vendors and already interoperable, paperless types of environments. Even the CROs that we brought on board, and they internalized some and made some proprietary efficiencies out of it, and kind of licensed those out to others. And then there was the ones that were just waiting on the sideline, and this happened. And I hear actually throughout this conversation being forced to change or being forced to take trials to patients. It's unfortunate that it took the backs of a fatal, deadly type of infection, a public health disaster. But that really has been the motivation for a lot. And I mean, this is the sense of polarizing. Either being forced or this was actually part of your trajectory. And I'm getting a sense that if it was part of your trajectory, then you've made prudent decisions and you forecasted for it and you incorporated technologies. If you were forced and if you had deep pockets, bigger pharma, then you could catch, you could kind of secure contracts with those. Otherwise, you were left behind in this whole queue of the ones that were doing it well. I could take deeper dive into this, so I don't want to monopolize all this time. Yes.
Those are great comments. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding. Would someone like to jump in? Jay, what about you're very quiet. What about from Dicerna's perspective? Did you notice the similar kind of polarization of your provider landscape, and was it difficult for you to access some of the new services that decentralized trials required?
Sure. So I think I agree with a lot of those comments. And, as we look to quickly pivot, as we all were faced with this ever-emerging pandemic, and we wanted to ensure patient continuity, we thankfully had some providers already in place. And then I will say kudos to our CRO partners who had, we were able to access vendors via their relationships. So still being a smaller biotech, maybe we don't have the same pull, but we utilized our relationship via our CRO to get the necessary vendors that we needed to be put in place, or the necessary priority that we wanted to be treated like big pharma, even though we were a small biotech. So I think it's definitely being creative. And as they say, it's also about who you know. So I think we all pulled a couple favors out of our pockets at times when needed to get things done. Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Love those comments. Anyone else want to add to that? No? Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. So this is one in particular for Mustafa. With so much fluctuation and change to manage as a result of COVID-19 and other challenges you had at AMAG, you mentioned relying on your CRO partners, just as kind of Jay mentioned, to help you quickly incorporate and implement new technologies. Can you share some examples and some of the benefits that you experienced?
Yes, thank you. I think it kind of relates to what I mentioned early on, and so far as, revisiting the entire trial design and asking questions at every data point that's being collected, what could be done differently, what needs to be done better, and how can we make this more patient friendly. So one of the I guess, examples of something like this was a clinical trial post-marketing requirement in the pediatric population for anemia. This was for our product which is an iron supplement or infusion for iron deficiency anemia, Farah Ahmad. And we were obviously struggling, like everybody else, so far as moving the trial forward, simply because it required a visit to the infusion center or the research site. It required a few hours of putting in an IV line and infusion, and then watching the patient for a period of time, making sure everything's okay, and then allowing them to return home. Of course, the patients being minor, it also necessarily meant that the parent or the guardian had to accompany them as well. So there were a lot of challenges that even if the patient wasn't at risk or the patient was able to participate, the parent or guardian might have had issues. So one of the ways that we looked at this was that, okay, can we identify a vendor or partner that will have the capability of actually bringing the procedure, doing the procedure, putting in the IV, and in fact doing the infusion right at home. Particularly in this case, the elements of it that would allow that would be that it was already an approved drug, at least for adults, that it was the safety was relatively well established, in that really the patients, other than, and of course anemia, were not deathly ill or didn't have acute illness to deal with, such as like an infection or cancer or something like that. So so in that case, though, we had to look at partners who had the capability for much of what I think, Sean, I really enjoyed Sean's presentation. Sean was explaining in terms of the capabilities of having, a research nurse who could be on a mobile unit, having the capabilities of, not just phlebotomy and the usual data collection, but actually in a placement of an IV line, etc., in an outpatient basis, and capability of infusion and capability of supervision remotely. And assessing the capabilities of how that could be possible, whether or not it would incur additional cost, or can the vendor or the CRO that was helping us could do that. So in our case, I think we quickly found out that the CRO that we were working with, being a more established company with a lot of subcontractors or vendors in their ecosystem, if you will, were able to give us some good recommendations with very real possibilities of solving these things. Inevitably, obviously, all of these things mean additional costs, and so the trade-off for us was to determine, the trade-off of time and completion of the trial versus the additional cost of essentially mobilizing the clinical trial site. And that was sort of what we had to do, and make the appropriate recommendations and make the appropriate choices.
So on the whole, Mustafa, do you think that was certainly an advantage for the patient to remain in their home? Is that something that you believe you will continue post-pandemic?
Yes, good question. From my perspective, yes. I think that, well, you say yes in the sense that it does allow a lot of patients to participate who would otherwise not be able to do all the things that Sean talked about in terms of the follow-up data and what needs to be done. But also, I think that it does force us, we all talk about patient-friendly, patient-centric clinical trials. The word is such a buzzword, everybody's, tossing it around. But I think the COVID situation has really forced us to think specifically about, every procedure, every intervention, every visit that we do as part of a clinical trial to see, to ask the question, is this really patient-centric or not? Can this be done safely, obviously, in a patient's home? Can this visit be done at patient's home, so on and so forth? So I think that is something that will continue. We will probably have many more of those visits. Certainly not this is not meant to be for every visit, but I think that what I foresee is that in the future we will move into a hybrid situation where what we thought would be a routine clinic visit for a trial will no longer be that routine visit. It'll have to be asked, can this be done virtually, in which will be much more substantial than a phone call, and I think more accurate and better, and therefore it'll leave the clinical visit, clinical research site visit to a frequency that is an absolute must-have. Certainly there will be a minimum number, but it'll be kept to a minimum, and I think it ultimately will benefit a lot of patients and enable more patients to participate. As I think Sean made a point there that it opens up the geography, and that somebody else mentioned it early on, that patients are no longer limited to a certain radius within which they have to be living to participate in a trial. They could participate from far away distances.
Those are very good points. I had not realized the limitation that some of these geographies could present. I'd love to hear from Shannon to maybe weigh in on this from a CRO perspective, just in terms of the closer partnerships that you might have built with your clients to help execute these changes on behalf of your customers. Shannon, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think so much of this was kind of quick learning. A lot of us had been dabbling with or trying to implement various forms of, hybrid decentralization, but hadn't quite been thrown into the deep end as we were, forced by our environment, of course. So, I do think one of the bigger things that we had to work together on as far as collaboration is just kind of understanding business continuity planning for a lot of these vendors. We were coming up with backup plans to the backup plans because so much in the landscape was a little bit unpredictable for us, right? So we found ourselves having conversations that were certainly a little bit higher risk than some of us were used to taking, but it was a collaborative risk in most cases. We had, as you can imagine, certain indications, these were truly life-saving therapies or patients screening in and ready to be dosed and treated, and we were having to work with vendors in the logistics space and needed to make sure that they were able to come through. All in all, when you take a step back and kind of consider some of the accomplishments that we were collectively able to pull off with this, it was nothing short of astounding, really, and in a lot of cases. And I'm not sure we're going to go back from that. So the pressure may be on in that regard. But yeah. But yeah, certainly it was forced creativity and all in all, huge.
I agree completely, Shannon. I think that the returning to the old ways is highly unlikely, as is the case for a lot of other things. For instance, just returning to offices is going to be probably not likely for most of us in this business. So I absolutely couldn't agree with you more. That I think some of the benefits that we're already seeing from this hybrid model are going to be part and parcel of how we conduct business in the future.
Totally agree. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. This one's for Katherine. You shared that Alexion had developed some really compelling analytics to navigate COVID-19 and find the patients for your trials. And this absolutely supported trial continuity, but there was a flip side. You observed a decline in quality and a data entry challenge at some of the sites. How were you able to address this?
Thank you, Farah. I'm so excited about all that I have to say, and I know we don't have much time. So I'm going to tell I think what was the best partnership and leadership that I discovered through working together under a COVID pandemic. And that is that we, besides the analytics, which we talked about earlier, to get ahead of where the patients will be and how they can get into the clinics, when we realized that there was going to be, certainly when we started Italy, we were not going to have our usual information coming in. We decided to pull together a task force, creating work streams, and really patient centricity, as you mentioned, Mustafa, was one really key point. But we went through and we developed 6 or 7 what we consider to be our business continuity points, certainly regulatory agencies and the information we would get from them. And then we sought to see, well, how much data would be missing and how much would be there but missing source data verification. I think that was the key. And then mirror that to what are our upcoming interim analysis and database locks. And we created a process where the study teams, so those individuals who were closest to the sites and to our vendor partners, would need to complete essentially a slide deck to tell us what is the state of your data. And the statistician would have to run trial interpretability reviews. And then we would bring that data to a leadership board, and we would talk about whether or not we would have those interim analysis or whether or not we would need to delay them. And we developed our decision making based on a framework. If it was a decision that would go to a regulatory agency, it would have the highest weight and go to the highest level of decision making. If it was for an ad board, a go, no-go decision, that would go to a different level of decision making. And we found that through that process that we also learned about each other, but also about what the sites were suffering to do, what our vendors were suffering to do, and we continued to use that process. So I think that's what I'm most proud of, and certainly all the analytics are important to infuse that information, but ultimately it was the way in which we developed the framework of decision making about what we should do with what we have today.
That's great. So definitely the formality of those reviews and having alignment at the leadership level facilitated that the execution of the approach. So it's great to hear that you had that alignment at Alexion right through to leadership.
Yeah, I mean, what we are trying to do is protect patients. And then to do that, we needed to make sure that we were inspection ready at any time, and that having that documentation of how we came to our decisions and making sure that we had an algorithm for decision making, we felt would be the best way to keep that trial integrity, to keep data integrity, and to understand that there are some locations where they may not have data. So rather than doing that 100% SDV, we actually were doing risk-based monitoring and making sure that we were following a process that could be repeated, so that we weren't making it up as we go, but we were also learning from it. We also had some data visualization tools that we were able to take in, for example, were protocol deviations being tracked appropriately when visits were missed. So we had that oversight piece that I think was also very important.
It's a great. I just love the formality in the process. Excellent.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in on that topic? If not, we'll kind of move to the next one. Okay, so this one is again for Shannon, looking at the CRO perspective. So we talked a little bit about you touched upon it in your prior comment on the selection of third-party providers. So how were you able to adopt kind of a vetting process to ensure that those providers were suitable to the new normal?
Yeah, so I mentioned, you know, kind of having an understanding of our vendors' business continuity plans, but, you know, all in all, it's a, you know, 100% just a risk-based approach. You know, in the beginning of it all, it was, you know, on the job, immediate, and, you know, as we worked through the learnings, we of course formed task forces with different work streams, some focused on logistics, some focused on what we were just talking about with respect to data currency and delivery, given where trials were in the life cycle altogether. And then, of course, work streams focused on our employees. So when we took the approach of how to understand what our vendors could and couldn't or would and weren't providing at the time, we had to go out and find backups. We needed to consider whether or not in centralized situations, we needed to consider alternative strategies. I mean, a lot of this obviously focused around protocol and study design in general. So when we're looking at how we assess managing this for current studies that we're being asked to evaluate, we are very heavily looking at patient visit schedules and kind of weighing in on where there may be opportunity for telehealth visits as opposed to patients coming in, alternative strategies with respect to, you know, lab draws, diagnostics that can be handled. You know, Sean kind of teed us up for some of that with his discussion around just digital platforms and working with groups like Thread as well. Certainly assessing home health care as a backup strategy. You know, I would say for anyone who is outsourcing to any CRO at this point, when putting a proposal in front of us and asking us to weigh in strategically and operationally on how we would deliver whatever it is you're asking us to assess, there should always be a COVID wave 2 strategy or a virtual decentralized hybrid strategy built into that, if for conversation, if nothing else, right? You may not embrace the entire proposal that we put in front of you, but elements of it will most likely be compelling. Your team may or may not have thought about that at that point as well. But if we're not talking about it, then we're not ready to pivot and make it happen.
I just wanted to add something interesting that Alexion did was, and this was mostly from the medical groups, but they created a COVID-19 reading club, which I thought was a genius and very rare. So I'd like to offer that as a suggestion.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's an opportunity for us to look outside of just what our functional responsibilities are and see what's happening in the COVID-19 literature. As we know, it's increasing. In the beginning, it was very difficult, but now it's interesting, and also to be a part of it. So as we share here today, but to actually share in journals so that we can do the best that we can do as a society in the industry. So I find that to be very enlightening.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it gives you a good broad understanding of the issues that may be occurring outside of your kind of departmental focus, but would still have an impact.
And we did get a comment from Nancy Sacco earlier. She agrees with Shannon. The impact of COVID-19 on starting or ongoing trials is important. And as I mentioned, since the activities and obligations were never in the original plans and strategies. That was Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to shift back to Bev. I'll slightly modify this question, Bev, since you did mention the use of the automation technology and Intellia for RFPs, the Clinical Maestro tool. Definitely just kind of thinking about it now, given that we are in the second wave and there is an increased vetting period going on. How can you, again, leverage the technology tools that you've onboarded to help kind of execute that vision in the landscape today? You mentioned bringing in some vendors kind of earlier. Has there been any other learnings over the course of the last kind of 6 months on how you could use that technology to continue to vet suppliers for their readiness through this second wave?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, Shannon, building off of Shannon's comments a few minutes ago on, kind of how do you further think about what's occurring in the environment and how do we adapt to that, which is the nice thing with using a technology, again, that that somebody else has built, but also has flexibilities, would be to build in some of those additional things that maybe we hadn't thought about previously around how you might consider managing through that pandemic. So, you know, building in different scenarios, which again, the technology that we utilize, Clinical Maestro, you had the ability to do kind of the standard. You have the ability to allow each of your CROs to have kind of what they, as they interpret your protocol and they look at what you're proposing, on what they think would fit in terms of, you know, different countries, different considerations around kind of the structure from a CRO perspective. But then you could also build in, you know, this other permutation around as we continue to Europe is already facing the second wave. You know, how does the CRO think about certain things around the remote monitoring, even about some of the things on visit schedule? All of those things could be built into looking at an additional, you know, different scenario planning and the costing tool of that to understand what your options are.
I think those are great comments. You know, certainly we've seen among sponsors just that greater bringing in these approaches into the RFP process, basically broadening the RFP process for contingency planning and using technology to process all of that data, even if it is still in the planning stage. We are having to, you know, have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, and possibly a plan D. So we're talking about, you know, quadrupling data that might sit in static data sources. So definitely some of the points that Shaheen had brought forward before around the progress of digital transformation will help organizations get more strategic in the RFP process.
So Farah, if I may.
Sure.
You know, so I think disaster preparedness is something that we don't do well. And when you plan, when you fail to plan, you're planning to fail.
Yeah.
That's the Margella's law. And we know that hurricanes happen. We've all experienced them. Mm-hmm. So part of, I think, our vetting of sites is, what is your preparedness plan? What's your disaster preparedness plan? We need to get ahead of that. So that's another opportunity I think we have to improve as an industry.
Absolutely. I remember in my CRO days being asked those questions on a routine basis, and you had the disaster plan, but definitely being able to execute the disaster plan, I think, is a whole other challenge.
Yeah, and that's the evidence of simulations, and not written simulations, but what do you have in place? You know, who are your suppliers? And keeping that up to date, just as we do at 1572. I think that it's pandemics will happen. Hurricanes will happen. We just simply, as a global entity, we just haven't come to put the money and invest the money into making sure that we're prepared.
Absolutely. I think having experienced this now in our lifetimes, hopefully we can change that. We can all influence that in some way. Okay, last question here before we get to the polls. So this one was... I was kind of referring to Katherine and Mustafa, but definitely all of you have had some mention of the theme of compromise. So we're talking about trade-offs and compromise as key themes in selecting vendors and in the landscape today with things moving so rapidly. I'd love to get some others to chime in on this. How has this impacted the diligence process? Katherine just talked about kind of looking at disaster planning. Any other elements that we'd like to share here? I think this is definitely pertinent to today's environment.
Are you asking me to comment, sir, Farah?
I'm asking for anyone to raise their hand.
I think one thing that I can say is that, you know, you remember about 5 or 6 years ago, Tom Friedman, who's a syndicate journalist and writes for the New York Times and also author of many books, wrote a book called "The World Is Flat." And in it, the premise of his book was that with new technology, essentially everyone has a even playing field. Whether you're in America or in China or India or Europe, wherever you are, everybody has a level playing field, and everyone can access the same type of information. I think this is also, in a way, has become true for us, because when we think about selecting new vendors, I think the old ways of gravitating towards the well-known names and geographies, etc., is now kind of out the door, because we're looking at everybody, regardless of their geographic location, because a lot of the activities, work, etc., will be done in such a way that it doesn't require geographic proximity. We don't have to stick with vendors that are in the Boston area or in the Northeast US or even in the East Coast. It can be anybody in the West Coast or Canada or outside of the US. So that is even more, I think, going to be the norm than it had been. So in that sense, I think that it provides us with a wider selection of vendors all over the world that could potentially be a partner for any company in this space.
Those are fantastic insights. So essentially, it's changing the criteria. It's broadening the scope or the net that you're kind of casting. Yeah. And it actually changes what might be the priorities and selection criteria as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Great. Anyone else like to chime in there? Trying to see if there's any questions. Perhaps Jay, from your side?
Sure. So, I think our diligence has only increased, in echoing a lot of the comments. So I'm trying not to be repetitive, but I think it is interesting as we continue to embark, and we are pressed to really expand our offerings and to think outside the norm. As I truly believe, as I said this morning, that there will be a paradigm shift in the way we're conducting these trials. And with that, it does require increased vetting, I think, because we're many of us are taking on new offerings or trying out new technology. So there's the uncertainty of trying something new in already uncertain times, and coupling that together, you have to do a risk assessment of how much risk are you willing to take on in trying out something new on, let's say, a pivotal study. How much risk are you willing to take on, because it doesn't always go as planned, as we know. And there's a lot of flying the plane as we're building it, unfortunately. So I think there's finding that balance, finding that compromise. And for me and for our organization, a lot of it is building upon our networks, whether it's our prior networks, our existing networks, using our vendors' networks to really try to get a leg up or some type of an insight on our vetting process.
Absolutely. Shaheen, did you want to add something to that?
Oh, sure. Yes. Just to add on to Jay's comments, yeah, we're all constantly compromising. I actually live between the worlds of digital health and biopharma, and digital health has always compromised, right? Because we've often used unvalidated measures, valued more data, then validation, and then more recently have gone through more regulated types of processes. The fun thing about one of the consequences of the pandemic and the biopharma's response, pharma is subsidizing the validation of many of these remote measures that are now going to have trickle-down effects in digital therapeutics. You're seeing deals with Click Therapeutics and BI and Otsuka and so on co-development. I think we've moved well beyond, telehealth and telemedicine. I remember maybe 15, 20 years ago doing telestroke consults at Cleveland Clinic. That's not on the forefront, but I think that's what gets most of the press. That's been here to stay, and that's going to continue to stay. Now I think we're getting equitable reimbursements for it. It's this whole other digital ecosystem that is the transformation, in my opinion, and not just to support traditional healthcare systems or traditional trial development, but actually to serve on its own. And so this is the essential pillar that's meant to be. Having said that, this is the pessimist in me. I'm seeing, since I represent a few companies now, a little drift back, a little drift to the mean comfort, as there's some semblance of normalcy that's reintroduced in our lives, and certainly in some of these investigative sites in different states. And I'm really, what's going to stick and what's going to be durable is up to us as a collective community. Regulation drives it tremendously. You've seen how you responded to many of those rapid guidances and letters. What's going to stick, right? Regulation is what drives transformation in industry. I mean, I hate to admit it, but that's what it does. And I think we're gonna lead by the heels of health regulators and how they continue to accept this challenge and pivot and adapt. How much missing data? I mean, here's the thing. A lot of studies, if they continue doing what they were doing, particularly in a reactive mode, they would have missing data. There's a realization that, hey, we could digitally collect vital signs, EKG, even other types of metrics and PROs and clinically reported outcomes. They might not be as good. They might not be validated. But it's better than missing data. So if we take that stance and that regulators hold that stance and they'll revert to the previous stance, then I think we're good. Yeah.
Yeah, Shaheen, I completely agree. I believe that the regulatory agencies have given us an amber light, not a green light. And I think it's up to us to show proof that we're ready for a green light.
Yes.
Well said, Katherine. So the business person to me will say that, will concur that absolutely regulation does provide the pathway, but it also provides opportunity. So we are presented with the opportunity today to transform and hopefully not to be forced to transform, but to do so out of strategy.